Good morning. We have Joe Wenberg here, Bluebird Semaphore, and this morning this should be World History for Ordinary People number 8. And I'm going to be talking about the Reformation and a little about Poland. But I want to start off by saying, because of the virus that's going on at this time, this is early April 2020, the library that I use is closed. And no two ways about it. I don't even think you could drop books off at the drop thing, which makes sense. You don't want anybody handling anything that isn't under control, strict control. I understand that. But it's making it rather impossible for me to get more information on the Reformation and on Poland, although I'm still getting some. But because it's so prominent in our thinking today, this virus, which is playing out not unlike other health events in the past, that it's anybody reading about the Reformation is going to come across over and over. They'll mention that either Erasmus or somebody else has taken off to a certain town to avoid, quote unquote, the plague, and they state it quite often. So it's obvious that even in 1520, 1509, 1500, there was still plenty of these mass epidemics going on. I think some of them happened more in the 14th century, but these were still going on in the 1500s. And it's quite ordinary to come across that reference when reading about these guys, Erasmus, Luther, and Calvin, and all these guys. And it was always typical, that the people who could afford to would exodus the cities, the urban spaces, and go to these country spaces where they could avoid the plague or whatever it was that was coming down on them, leaving the unfortunate individuals who didn't have that choice because of lack of means to stay behind and, in many cases, fall victim to the epidemic of the time. Now, in reading these books that I'm reading on Reformation, there's two other diseases that keep coming up. And one of them, I made certain assumptions. And on the other one, totally didn't know anything about it. But one of them simply say that so-and-so had stone. I didn't even say the stone. I just say so-and-so had stone. He had stone. They had stone. And yeah, you kind of figure out it's going to be kidney stone or something like that. And I looked it up on the web, and that's certainly what it implied. And way back in history, they had the stone. They even have a mummy that's either 4,000 years old or 4,000 BC that they could tell had the stone or stone. And then they list at least 20 or more surgeons, ancient types, who were well equipped to do the surgery to take care of kidney stones. Now, the other disease that keeps coming up when I'm reading about the Reformation is, they say, and this happened to Erasmus, he got the sweats. Oh my God, can you imagine that? Getting the sweats. Anyway, yeah, you would sweat profusely. I think you ran a fever. Maybe you had a very, very dry throat that you couldn't even talk. And you would also fall into hilarious fits. And this would go on for a while, and sometimes you would die from it, and other times you got through it. Now, this particular disease, the sweats, cropped up around, I'm going to be a little vague here, either like 1450 and it was over, never heard from again by 1550, 100 years. Or it could have been 1550 to 1650. All I know is that it lasted 100 years. England was the epicenter of the sweats. So I thought I would talk about that a little bit because we have this virus thing going on right now, and everybody's very conscious about health and trying to avoid getting sick, and rightly so. But where am I with the Reformation? Well, here's where I am. Basically, it is now a dichotomy. Erasmus is going in direction A, and Luther is going in direction B. Erasmus, he does a little piece of history here I'm going to talk about, that his wonder boy, and Erasmus is very anti-war by this time, 1515, at that time frame, 1509, 1515. He's very anti-war. He's written some things about it. He's even presented some of his writing to Henry VIII, who was his, immensely fond of Henry VIII. That's Erasmus was when Henry VIII was much younger. By now we're talking he's about 20. He got his coronation, he was 17 going on 18. He enjoyed his early years as the sovereign, and by the time he's 20, he's feeling his oats, and he wants to go a conquering and a warring. So, and Erasmus gets wind of this, and he's very upset, because like I said, he's very anti-war. He doesn't think it's Christian. How can you be Christian if you're going around killing primarily other Christians? It just doesn't make sense. Now, they argued, the theologians back in that day, they argued you could do war for this reason, you could do war for that reason, and all the other reasons, then you could do it. And look, and they point to the Bible, and they point to this, and they point to all the doctors of the faith. It justifies killing. So be it. But anyway, like I said, Henry VIII, now he wants to emulate his father. These guys all had images of, I'm going to stretch here a little bit, but they all had images of Alexander the Great in their head, and they all probably worshipped at the altar of Alexander the Great. But don't forget, Alexander the Great was doing this 350 BC. They were a lot more primitive at the time, and they certainly didn't have any ideas of, although Aristotle did try to teach Alexander ethics and what have you. But overall, the people alive in the day were not clearly thinking about anti-war or peace and that kind of stuff. They were thinking about conquering the world. If you conquered it, you were better off than your neighbor who didn't conquer it. So anyway, these upstarts now in the Middle Ages, and then in the Renaissance, and in the time of the Reformation, they still had Alexander the Great on their minds. And Henry VIII wanted to emulate his father and do some conquering. So he picked, and he was gonna do battle with France, and he gets 20,000 soldiers, and he gets 300 ships, and they crossed the channel. They had a nice channel crossing, I understand, and they went into Calais, which was an area that Britain controlled. It wasn't their territory, their country, but they controlled this stretch of land. So they went there and they plundered the first town. You raised it to the foundations, everything, and that was joyous for them. And then they decided to do one more, which they didn't raise to get everything was torn down and all the people killed and all that stuff. They just got that town to agree not to do anything bad against the British, and everybody would be happy. So I guess Henry VIII was okay with that, and he decided he did 20 days of feasting and jousting to celebrate his unbloody victory. And when that was over, he turned around and went back across the channel. But in the meantime, this is the way history goes. In the meantime, the King of Scotland, who I believe was Henry V, he says, "Oh, I see an opportunity. Henry VIII is out of the country. Let's go sneak in from the north," because he was the King of Scotland. "Let's go sneak in from the north and take Henry's country away from him." So he goes to battle, and he's got his son Arthur with him. And of course, they lose. Henry gets killed. Arthur gets killed. And it's just a bloody waste. Erasmus gets back, and he writes commentaries on the unnecessary slaughter, so on and so forth. So like I said, he was a very early anti-war type. And at this particular time in his life, he was pretty much writing the genesis of European liberal thinking, and we point to him as being a humanist. So all this humanistic tendencies, this was where it really started, really big time. Erasmus and his teachings, and he was a big proponent of education and good education. He wanted people to be scholars. But, we read into it that he wanted education for everybody, which is not true. He wanted good education so that the people at the top of any country following his methods would be able to think clearly, brightly, informatively, and on their feet, so to speak. And this Erasmus type of education lasted as the foremost methods of education up until the end of the 19th century. So we're talking about, all of 16, all of 17, 18, 300 or 400 years of education model was based on Erasmus. So, that in and of itself, would put Erasmus high on the list of humans who passed this way. But I don't believe it has anything to do with theology. Obviously, education has to do with sociology. So Erasmus was a very big, in my estimation, social proponent of getting out of the dark ages and coming into the light. And I don't know that much about Erasmus either, by the way. But, if he did these things, if he insisted on Latin and Greek and Hebrew and science this and philosophy that in your education, then I grant him kudos for being right on and doing the right thing. Only problem is it never filtered down to the bulk of the human population. And clearly his vision was to make sure that the people who were at the top of the social structure had the mental facility to make good decisions. And he would hope that it would lead to the absence of war and other unnecessary unpleasantries. Now, on the other hand, Luther was going off in another direction. He was still, he had been given many accolades. He got to be the dean of, I want to call it of a whole diocese, or, the top cleric of 2 dioceses. And that gave him a lot of work to do, because now he was having to take care of many more clerics and many more parishioners, and had a lot of work on his plate. He also still had time to be a professor, and still was highly sought by many people to give his, we would call them lectures, you may call them sermons, but in 1509, he was called on to give a sermon on St. Paul's epistles to the Romans. and it's usually referred to as St. Paul's Romans. They boil it down to that saying, St. Paul, Roman, and then they'll give the chapter verse. And so he gets this in 1509, and he doesn't give the sermon until 1515. You wonder what he was doing those 6 years. But what he was doing, he reached out to the foremost publisher in England, just as he had reached out to the foremost publisher in Venice a few years early to get these hard-to-get, rare manuscripts. He reached out, and he got what he needed, and he studied, and he gave his lecture. And it was, I believe they were well received, but as far as publication, it never really took off, and it just kind of sat in the background. We would say it was on the back plate for years and years and years. But I want to just get out to the reason why this became very important, because scholars studying Luther and what Luther had done in his life, much of this is what did he read and what did he get from it. So what they got from this sermon and preaching on Paul Roman, now we're talking about Paul the Apostle, not a true apostle. This is Paul who came later. Not really that much later, but he wasn't an apostle. He was Paul, and Antioch. I think he came out of Antioch. And they believe that this is where he got that aha experience. He saw clearly that this is where they got the I don't want to say the right, but this is where they could clearly see through divine revelation that they were instructed to make themselves, considered themselves to be saved if they believed in Jesus Christ, and truly wholeheartedly. You can't just say it, but if you do that, that was the way you're taking on this responsibility to do this, just as God had taken on responsibility to do it for all of us. You're doing your belief in Jesus Christ and the life he led, good man, humble, charitable, so on and so forth. You take on this belief in Jesus Christ, you will be saved. Prior to that, you had all these other theories, was that only a few would be saved. You would be condemned to hell. You would be this and that. Very harsh stuff. And Luther and many others didn't like that concept. So they read into Paul, and Paul didn't say it in those words, but they were able to deduce and then make certain conclusions after reading what Paul said. So this is like me reading history and then coming up with an opinion, which I do all the time, but I try to warn you when I do that this is just opinion, okay? So, look, people generally throughout history, they get to a point where they can't tolerate what's going on anymore, and they make changes. So a lot of folks were at that point at the time Paul came on the scene, and they wanted to make changes. And Paul made his disciples and followers make certain changes. And I think in one of the books I'm reading, they kind of say that after a while of doing this, and Paul was on one of his many long journeys, they point at a particular moment, and they say that that's the true beginning of the Christian church. And I'm vaguely remembering what I read, but I believe it had something to do with a conversion of his. He converted, and it was a woman he converted. And I'm reading that some scholars point to as that's when the Christian church really began. And what I think is interesting is that it's difficult to find out the beginnings of this Christianity. You really got to do some digging. And an opinion of mine is that, whoever starts a God-based religion, I don't think that entity would make it next to impossible to figure out how or what its genesis was. I think they would not be hiding behind so many roadblocks to come to understanding, which is what we have. We've had it for centuries, if not millennium. And so, the concept, Paul is very big. This Paul the Apostle is very big with the Christians. He's almost like number one after Jesus. Number one, big time. They adore his writings. And just, I just want to say that if you wanted to get an understanding of what Christians believe, and let's say you're not a Christian, I would point you to reading St. Paul's epistles. There's not that many of them, It's not like reading the whole Bible, that'll take a long time. But you read St. Paul's epistles, I think you'll understand. Although, once again, you got to be careful because he's going to use, figures of speech and idioms that we no longer really understand. So it's a problem no matter how you look at it. You're studying early religion. It's a problem. It got translated so many times from this language to that language to the other language. You don't know if you're reading this or that or the other thing. But I'm on another track, folks, and I'll tell you, I'm on a new track, and I've been on this track for a long time, trying to get a bead on Josephus. Josephus was a historian who was alive even while the new Christian church was being born. So he's considered one of the great historians of all time. But, listen, what's the greatest historian of all time? I don't know. But so some of the stuff I'm going to read when I'm reading Josephus, it's the same name as me, you understand? Okay. So he are going to be, actual visual sightings that he did and knowledge of people. He was a noble. His lineage, to be a noble, his lineage went to the priestly ranks back then. And Jewish, Pharisee, that sect, so he was there. He saw, he wrote, he told, Did he embellish? Of course he did. Everybody embellishes, except me. I never embellish. But, so I'm on that beat. And that'll be a very, very long beat. And I think all I'll do is just throw things in now and then. Because, I don't really see myself doing ancient history, although I might. I mean, I'm intrigued with Greece and even the Romans. I'm intrigued, but I would start digging with the Greeks because they're really, for me, Western civilization's beginnings. And I would love to go back and reread some Plato stuff because that was really, I really liked it. Now, the point that I want to make is, but even Josephus, and a lot of times they'll say two names of two historians. They'll say Herodotus is another historian who he was writing in the BCs, like 200, 300 BC or whatever, maybe even around the same time that Aristotle was functioning. And he was a traveler, big time. He went here, there, and everywhere. And I had read a good deal, I would say maybe 60% of his histories. And then I fast forward through a couple of times, parts of that were most interesting to me. So, but that was years ago. So I got to redo that too. So I'm on that beat as well. And I wanted to say about Josephus, most of what he was seeing and doing was in and around the area that the Christian religion developed. We're talking about Palestine, we're talking about Judea, we're talking about the Eastern Mediterranean. Okay, so it's not such a large area that we're going to lose track, I don't think, with Josephus. Some splendid maps with the names of the cities and towns of the day, what they were called in the day. Like the Sea of Galilee on this map is called something else. So that's pretty much the way the Reformation is going. Martin Luther is he's at the point where he knows, he's grasped what it is he wants to and how he wants to reform. Okay, he knows that, and it is through the St. Paul, the Apostles' epistle to the Romans, where he got his big breakthrough mental position on this. And you know, his writings, he had taken that manuscript from that publisher in England, and he had notated it all over the place. They order a special type of manuscript with wide spaces and on the edges and wide spaces between the lines so they can annotate it. That's the way those scholars did back in the day. So, which was, I think, was a great idea. And that's what they did. But that manuscript pretty much got lost. Then, in the latter part of the 19th century, as people started finding it again. They found it in Berlin, they found it here, they found it there. But the point is that in 1890-ish, some scholar read it and put two and two together, and they said, that's where Luther came up with this idea of going in a new direction. This was the founding moment of Lutheranism. And the rest is history. So that's how a new idea came into being. Martin Luther doing this, and you know, the actual Lutheran faith was around much, you know, for years before this manuscript was found, because people pretty much took him at his word. They didn't need to back it up with documentation. You know, I mean, I would insist on some documentation, as I always do, except when I'm making opinions, and that's different. But it's still more to go, more to read, no doubt, with these two guys. But I'm finding it difficult because the libraries are closed because of the virus, so I can't get there to get the volumes, the books that I want. As far as the Polish thing is going, you know, this thing, the entire last half of this book is pretty much that the Poles get taken over, then they come back and they recreate their form of government, then they go away to recreate the form of government. It's back and forth. Many prominent people in the world were Polish, and he lists them, and it seems like a great civilization. And yet, what did the other powers do? They don't help them when they need help. Even before World War II, it's the end of World War I, Poland is now capable, if they can get the ammunition, of holding off Germany on the the western border, and Russia on the west. So they asked the powers of the League of Nations, give us the arms you took over from Germany, and we will defend this region. Okay? France wanted to do it, and probably some other countries, but good old England, no, you ain't getting that ammunition, because France will become strong and they may fight us. Oh, no. And one statement was actually, I'd rather have a Russian Bolshevik than a collapsed economy. So they set the stage for Germany to get big again, get powerful again, let the maggot get into his position, okay? And then we had World War II, and we had million deaths. Why? Because, no, we're not going to let you do that, even though it makes absolute sense. No. The French may get too strong, and they may try to take us over. What, in the 20th century, France was going to take over England? You're crazy. So, some craziness from the English won the day. Poland was put in the ground, and we lost, I want to think we lost 60 million in that war. And I don't even know if I'm counting the war in the Pacific. So, Poland is, in many cases, a tragic case of world history, except it had its glorious days in the beginning. And it's back onto glory again. You know, they will be a glorious part of today and the future. I have no doubt about that. And I'm loving the story of Lech Walesa, the shipyard electrician who held off the Russians at Gdansk shipyard, and set the stage for the eventual coming down of the Iron Curtain and the freedom of his people. That was in the 80s, 1980s. And on that too, the rest is history. The book I'm reading on Poland got me confused because the Polish Pope was John Paul II. They said he was Pope from 1958 to when he died in 1978 or 1982. I don't know. Pretty long time. I think 82. And I said, wait, it can't be 1958. It can't be. It just can't be. But I said, you know what? I'm going to trust them. That's what they said. Then it must be right. Lo and behold, somewhere later on, I'm reading about John Paul. Actually, because I wanted to. I went to the web. John Paul II, and he was consecrated bishop in 1958, and then Pope, I think, in 1962 or something like that. So, you know, I think in that religion, once you consecrated a bishop, you're almost everything that anybody else can be, a cardinal, a pope. The only thing, the Pope is infallible on matters of faith. But so that's why the book that I read said 1958. And so this is a point of where you have to be careful when you're reading history, because you could be led astray like I was, you know? And while I was saying this, I started to think of yet another part of what I've been reading the last week was, and it's something I'm a little bit upset about. And St. Paul's Cathedral in London, there's at least two versions of it. One is old St. Paul's, and the other is St. Paul's that we see today. Now, whenever I've seen movies and documentaries and pictures, I always see old St. Paul's, which is a gorgeous edifice, just gorgeous, you know, perfect. And that's the image I have always had in my head. Yet because I'm looking into this, St. Paul's you have now, which I think was done in 1660. There was a great fire in London around that time. And so we got a brand new, 1660, St. Paul's. And it's not, from the outside anyway, anything remarkable to look at. It's got a great big dome, and it's bulky, and it's, you know, it's roundish, and not very good lines at all. So I am upset because I've been misled all these years by, I guess, not false documentaries, but trying to give us a different impression of what St. Paul's was. So, once again, if you're looking on the web and you see pictures of St. Paul's, and you think you're looking at St. Paul's when perhaps, you know, I want to say, I don't know, 1400s, let's say, okay? I couldn't think of a person I wanted to associate with it. But you got to watch it because you know, the old St. Paul's looked one way and the new St. Paul's looks another way. I would say the new St. Paul's try to take on the look of St. Peter's in Rome. That's what I would say. And the old St. Paul's was, to me, very Gothic in its approach to architecture. And I guess I'm partial to that look, the Gothic look, 14th century, nice stuff. Okay, on that note, I'm going to leave you for the day. And maybe next time I'll have a whiteboard with me and I could write on it and make drawings and be absolutely silly. Thank you for watching World History for Ordinary Peoples. This was session 8, I believe.